The coffee maker gurgled at 5 in the morning the way it always did, the way it had done every morning for 31 years in the same kitchen, on the same counter, in the same house in Millbrook, Ohio. Margaret Calloway stood at the counter in her robe and reached for two mugs without thinking. She set them both on the counter, filled them both, and stood there looking at the second one for a long moment before she poured it back into the pot. 9 years, she still did this. Not every morning anymore, but enough mornings that she had stopped being surprised by it. Frank had been gone 9 years, and her hands still remembered his coffee before her mind caught up with the present tense. She carried her mug to the kitchen table and sat down in front of a piece of paper she had been looking at for 4 days without doing anything about it. The paper had an address on it, 14 Aldrich Street, Harwick, Connecticut. Below the address, in the slightly trembling handwriting of a man named Leonard Shaw, who was 70 if he was a day, and had been practicing estate law in Hartford for 4 decades, was a single line that had not appeared in the official letter of notification. Vera said she wanted you to come before you decide. Not if you want to come. Not please consider coming. Before you decide. As though the decision itself depended on the visit, as though Vera Calloway had arranged things in a particular order and expected that order to be followed. Maggie had not seen Vera Calloway in more than 20 years. They were distant relations, the kind who existed at the outer edges of family gatherings, faces you recognized in photographs, names on Christmas cards that had stopped arriving sometime in the 1990s. Vera had been older, quieter, the sort of woman who stood near the window at family events, rather than in the center of the room. Maggie had meant to call her. Several times over the years, she had meant to call. She had not. And now Vera was gone, and she had left Maggie a 6-story brick building in a Connecticut city Maggie had never visited, and a lawyer with shaking handwriting had written one sentence at the bottom of a formal document that felt less like information and more like an instruction. Maggie drank her coffee and looked at the address and thought about the vegetable garden she shared with Phyllis next door, which needed tending. She thought about the library where she went on Tuesdays and checked out more books than she could read in a month, because the act of checking them out made the week feel organized. She thought about Sandra in Edinburgh, who called every Sunday, and Michael in Denver, who called every other Wednesday, and how both of them always said "I love you" at the end of every call and meant every word of it, and how the week stretched out between those calls in ways she had not expected when she was younger. She thought about Frank. She thought about the way the reading chair had been angled toward the west window for 9 years now, positioned to catch the afternoon light, positioned the way she had moved it after the funeral, when the apartment had suddenly had too much furniture for one person. She had not moved it back. She was not sure she ever would. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She left for Harwick the next morning at 6. The radio on the drive was tuned to a station that played old country songs she did not particularly like. She knew this about herself lately, that she made less effort with small things, that she let whatever was on stay on. It had started after Frank died and had deepened over the years in ways she could not precisely describe. A slow narrowing of the particular kind of energy required to change the channel, to choose differently, to care about the small preferences that added up to a life with texture. The country songs played through 4 states, and she did not change the station once. Harwick, Connecticut announced itself gradually. She came off the highway onto a 2-lane road that ran through old neighborhoods, blocks of Victorian houses with deep front porches, a main street with the kind of storefronts that indicated a town working hard to reinvent itself. A hardware store next to a wine bar. A laundromat next to a gallery selling abstract paintings for prices she could see from the sidewalk. And at regular intervals affixed to lamp posts into the plywood fencing around empty lots, signs in blue and white that read, "Whitmore Residential coming soon, a new Harwick for a new generation." She noticed the signs without knowing why she was noticing them. She drove past them and found Aldrich Street and turned left and pulled to the curb in front of the building. It rose 6 stories above the sidewalk brick that had once been red and had darkened over the decades to something closer to the color of old tobacco. The arched entrance was flanked by carved stone columns, and above the arch, in raised letters that had been weathered but not entirely erased, the year 1924. To the right of the door, mounted on the brick, a brass plate that had gone green with age, but still legible if you stepped close enough to read it, the Harwick Arms. Maggie stepped close enough to read it. Then she tried the key. It did not go in. Not part way, not with resistance, simply not at all. The lock had swollen, or the key had warped, or time had done something to the tolerances between them that 20 years of neglect will do. She tried again. She tried with the key angled slightly upward, then slightly down, then with a sustained forward pressure that accomplished nothing except to confirm that the door intended to remain closed. She stood on the cracked sidewalk for a moment looking up at the building, and then she walked 3 blocks to a hardware store she had passed on the way in. The man behind the counter was 60 or so, with the permanently squinting eyes of someone who had spent decades working with small parts and bad lighting. His name tag said Earl. She explained what she needed. Earl handed her a can of WD-40 and looked at her with mild curiosity. "That building down on Aldrich," he said. "I thought it was vacant. Been vacant since last year, far as I knew." Maggie thanked him and carried the can back to the building. She worked the lubricant into the lock and waited and tried again and worked it in more and waited again. And 20 minutes after she had started with a grinding reluctance that felt almost personal, the key turned and the door opened. The smell that came out was layered. Old wood on top, the particular dry smell of a building that has been breathing its own air for a long time. And underneath that, something else she could not name yet, something that would take her a moment to identify. The lobby was dim lit by the gray October light coming through the door she had propped open behind her. The floor was linoleum worn to a dark polish in the center path, where generations of feet had walked lighter and more distinct at the edges where traffic had been sparse. The mailboxes along the right wall were the old brass-faced kind, a row of small doors with combination locks, most of them scratched and clouded with age. She almost walked past them. She stopped. 3 of the mailboxes had labels on them. Not old labels, not the kind of paper that turns yellow and peels at the corners after years of humidity. New labels written in ink that had not faded in handwriting that was recent enough to be deliberate. Unit 2A Brennan, Unit 3B Barrett, Unit 4A Greer. Alhalmer. Maggie stood in the dim lobby of what she had been told was a vacant building and looked at 3 names written in fresh ink and understood with a particular clarity that arrives before the full meaning has processed that this building was not vacant. She looked more carefully at the mailboxes, and there below the 3 new labels, nearly lost in the scratched surface of the brass, was a 4th label. Older than the others by years, the ink faded to the ghost of a ghost, the paper so yellowed it had nearly become the same color as the metal behind it. She had to lean close to read it. Calloway. Vera Calloway, who had left this building to a distant relative who had not called in 20 years, had kept her own mailbox in this lobby, had considered this place home until whatever the end of her life had looked like, had lived here or returned here or simply maintained this small record of belonging in the form of a label on a brass door. From somewhere above her, from floors she could not see, came the sound of music. A record player, she thought. Something slow and deliberate and unmistakably jazz, the kind of recording that had been made in a room with good acoustics by musicians who were listening to each other very carefully. The sound came through concrete and years and arrived in the lobby softened but distinct. Maggie looked at the stairs. She picked up her bag and started climbing. The 2nd floor landing smelled like butter and brown sugar. Warm and specific, not the ghost of a smell, but an active one recent. A thin line of amber light showed under the door of Unit 2A, and the warmth was coming from there. Maggie knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, and the sounds from inside stopped completely, a cessation so total it was its own kind of answer. The voice came after a beat, young female drawn tight as a wire. "Building's closed." "I know," Maggie said. "I own it." Another beat, longer this time, the kind of pause that contains a calculation. The chain came off the door 2 inches. A face appeared in the gap. Young 17 or close to it, with hair pulled back and flour on both forearms, and eyes that were doing exactly what Maggie's eyes were doing, moving over a stranger in a doorway and trying to determine what kind of stranger they were. "You're the owner," the girl said. It was not a question. "I am." The door opened. What had been a standard apartment kitchen was now a working bakery in miniature, or perhaps not so miniature. Sheet pans covered every horizontal surface. Wire cooling racks lined the wall. A commercial-grade stand mixer that had no logical business being in a residential kitchen stood in the corner like a piece of furniture that had wandered in from another life. The smell in the room was extraordinary. Not just bread, but something more particular. A dense sweetness with dried fruit worked into it, the kind of baking that happens when someone has learned a recipe thoroughly enough to make it their own. The girl had crossed her arms. She was small, but she held herself in a way that made the room feel like her territory, which Maggie supposed it was. "Sadie," the girl said. "Maggie?" Sadie looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, a complicated thing like a door opening slightly before someone decides whether to open it further. "Vera said you'd come," Sadie said. "She said eventually you would." Maggie was quiet for a moment. That stopped her, and she let it stop her. "She said you would," Sadie continued. "Not might," said. "I paid her $40 a month." Sadie added the defiance, returning directed now at the middle distance rather than directly at Maggie. "I know the kitchen isn't licensed, but I'm not hurting anyone. I've been here 8 months." She paused. "I'm not going back where I came from." She said the last sentence the way people say things they have had to say before to other people in other rooms, people who had the power to send them somewhere they did not want to go. Maggie looked around the kitchen. Against the wall beside the back door, several paper bags were stacked, each one labeled in careful handwriting with a name and a unit number. More bags sat on the table near the window. She picked one up and looked at the label. "May I?" she said. Sadie nodded once. Inside the bag was a roll, dense and warm and soft at the center, with a sweetness she could not immediately identify. She ate half of it standing in the kitchen and did not say anything while she ate it because she was too occupied with noticing the quality of it, the way it had been made by someone who understood what they were doing. "The other floors," Maggie said when she had finished. Sadie met her eyes. "You should see for yourself." She went up to the third floor and knocked on the door of Unit 3B. The man who opened it was compact and direct, the kind of man who takes up exactly as much space as he needs and no more. 44 or thereabouts, with the particular build that comes from 2 decades of physical labor, not the gym kind, but the carrying and lifting and working in bad weather kind. He shook Maggie's hand and looked at her squarely the way someone looks when they have decided in advance not to pretend about anything. His name was Tom Barrett. His wife Ann appeared from the kitchen with a cup of tea before Maggie had said 10 words, which was its own kind of statement about what kind of people lived here. 4 children arranged themselves along the length of a worn sofa from 4 years old to 12, watching the visitor with the careful attention of children who have learned that visitors sometimes mean change. "We've been here 2 years, Tom said. "Paid what we could." Vera understood. He paused. "The boiler? 3 winters, I've kept it running. Nobody asked me to, but it was the right thing." Maggie sat in the chair Ann indicated and drank her tea and looked at the photographs on the walls. One of them showed a farmhouse surrounded by green fields, the kind of green that belongs to a particular region, and she looked at it long enough that Ann, who had been watching her look at it, said quietly, "Vermont, our place. We leased that land for 12 years. The owner sold to an agricultural company. We had 90 days. Tom found work in Hartford. We couldn't afford housing there while we waited for the first paycheck. Vera let us stay here while we sorted it out." She stopped. The implications settled into the room without requiring completion. The sorting out had taken longer than 90 days. Maggie set down her tea and prepared to leave. And that was when Tom Barrett said the thing he had been deciding whether to say since she had knocked. "You thinking of selling to Whitmore?" It was direct enough that Ann put her hand on her husband's arm, not to stop him, but to be next to him for whatever came back. The 4 children on the sofa went very still. "I haven't decided anything," Maggie said. That was the truth. Tom nodded slowly. "All right, but if you do," he said, "you should know something. Whitmore's not the kind of man who keeps his word to people who don't have lawyers, and his brother Roy is the one who shows up after the paperwork's done. Roy doesn't come to help anyone move. It was the first time she had heard the name Roy Whitmore. She carried it upstairs with her. The fourth floor was different in its quality of silence. The door of Unit 4A stood partly open, and through the gap, she could see a room furnished with the patient simplicity of someone who had reduced their life to what mattered. An armchair positioned at the window, a record player on a side table with a careful stack of vinyl albums at its base, and the man in the armchair, perhaps 80 years old, perhaps older, sitting with his hands loose in his lap, watching the street below, with the steadiness of someone who has been watching it for a long time. He did not turn when Maggie knocked on the open door. He did not turn when she said his name, which she had gotten from the mailbox label. He turned his head just enough to indicate that he had heard, and then he turned back to the window. She sat down in the second chair. There were two chairs in the room positioned side by side at the window. It was the kind of arrangement that implies a habit, two people sitting here regularly looking out at the same view. The second chair had a small table beside it with a coaster on it. The coaster had a ring on it from a cup that had been set there many times. Maggie looked around the room while the record played. Along the far wall, covered with a white cloth that draped all the way to the floor, was a shape that she almost took for a piece of furniture, but after a moment identified as a piano. The cloth had been on it long enough that the fabric had taken on a faint discoloration along the edges. On the shelf beside the record player sat a framed photograph face down. The dust pattern around it showed that it had been standing upright until recently and had been turned over deliberately. Beside the photograph, a sealed envelope. The return address, Owen Greer, Portland, Oregon. The record ended. The needle found the inner groove, and the room filled with the soft, repeated sound of it tracking empty vinyl. Maggie stood, lifted the needle, looked through the stack of albums, and put on a different one. Ahmad Jamal, the label said. She sat back down. They listened together for a while without speaking. And then, as she was preparing to stand and leave, Walter Greer said two words. His voice was rough with disuse, the way a hinge sounds when it has not been moved in a long time. "Come back," he said. Not a question, not quite a request. Something between the two that was harder to refuse than either. The fifth floor. The door of Unit 5C had a handmade sign taped to it at eye level. "Do not disturb. Research in progress." She knocked twice and was turning to leave when she heard the locks. The man who opened the door was 63 and held himself in a way that suggested he had once been someone with authority and was still in the process of figuring out what he was now. His glasses needed cleaning. He held a stack of papers against his chest with both arms, a posture that was either protective or organizational, and might have been both. He spoke before she could. "You're going to file to Whitmore." "I don't think you know that," Maggie said. He studied her for a moment with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. Then he stepped aside. "Come in. There are things you need to see." The apartment was an archive in collapse. Document boxes stacked to the ceiling. Accordion files bound with rubber bands. Loose papers arranged in stacks that had their own internal logic visible only to the person who had made them. The air smelled like old paper and something underneath it that she thought might be the particular smell of someone who had been spending all their waking hours in the same room with the same problem for a long time. On the one surface of the desk, she could still see clearly framed and centered in a way that suggested it was the thing he oriented. Everything else around was a photograph of a woman in her early 40s, standing in front of what appeared to be a municipal building, smiling at the camera, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who did not usually think about how they looked in photographs. "Dorothy," he said when he saw Maggie looking. "Dot. My wife." He placed one hand briefly on the frame. "She passed 2 years ago. I came here because I didn't know where else to go." His name was Douglas Finch. He had been a city archivist for 15 years before he was dismissed officially for misappropriation of resources, which he explained meant that he had taken copies of documents he was not supposed to take and then refused to destroy them when his supervisor asked him to. Dot had been a local history teacher for 25 years. In the last year of her life, she had found something in public land records that had disturbed her enough to begin keeping notes, a pattern of zoning changes, improper transactions that should not have lined up the way they did. She had not had enough time to do anything with what she had found. Douglas had come to Horrock with her boxes and her notes and her unfinished question, and he had been working on the answer ever since. Not because he was an investigator, because it was the only way he had found to remain in some kind of contact with the person he had spent 31 years being connected to. He pulled a sheet from one of the stacks. Maggie looked at the name on it. Helen Calloway, 23 years old, municipal clerk, missing since June 1975. She sat down in the chair he had cleared for her. She did not sit down because she was tired. She sat down because she needed to be sitting for this. She knew that name. Not well and not recently, but she knew it the way you know things you heard as a child, half remembered, never fully explained. Helen Calloway had been Vera's daughter. She had disappeared when Maggie was young, and the adults in the family had said in the way adults said certain things to children that Helen had run away, that she had gone off somewhere. The conversation had always ended there. She didn't run, Douglas said. He showed her the rest of it. It took him 20 minutes to explain, and for most of it, Maggie sat and listened without interrupting because 3 decades as a bookkeeper had taught her how to read the shape of financial information, and the shape of what Douglas was showing her was becoming clearer with each page. She found something, Douglas said. She was working as a file clearer for a city contractor, and she found a permit application from May 1975 that had been approved in 7 days. Standard approval took 4 to 6 weeks. The person who signed the approval left city employment the following year and retired to Florida. The company that submitted the application was a shell. When you trace it back through enough layers, the ownership comes back to a family with a name that is still very present in this city. He put the final page on the table between them. The report on Helen Calloway's disappearance filed June 1975, signed by the detective assigned to the case. Detective R.H. Whitmore, Harwick Police Department. The father of Arthur Whitmore. The case had been closed in 3 months. Voluntary disappearance, no further investigation. Maggie looked at the name on the page for a long time. Vera knew all of this, she said. It was not a question. Vera spent 30 years gathering what she could, Douglas said. She let me live here because she needed somewhere safe for all of this. He looked at Maggie over his glasses. And she left you the building because she needed someone who couldn't be bought. He paused. Dot used to say that the most dangerous person in any situation is the one who has already decided they have nothing to lose. Maggie looked at the photograph of Dorothy Finch on the desk. A woman in her 40s standing in front of a building smiling, beginning something she didn't get to finish. Tomorrow, Maggie said. I'll come back tomorrow and we'll go through all of it. Douglas nodded. All right, tomorrow. She went back down to the lobby and sat on the bottom step. The building was quiet around her in the way that buildings are quiet when people are in them, a different quality of silence than abandonment, textured with the small sounds of habitation. From above came the faint thread of jazz that Walter Greer was still playing on his record player. The boiler knocked once and settled. From the second floor, barely audible, the sound of a timer. She had driven 4 hours to sign a form and go home. She had 4 days booked at a motel 6 blocks away. She had a vegetable garden that needed attention, and a library card she had used every Tuesday for 3 years, and a daughter who called on Sundays. She sat on the step and let herself notice that she did not want to leave. Not because the building was beautiful, which it was not, or because the situation was simple, which it was certainly not, but because sitting here in the dim lobby with the jazz coming down from the 4th floor and the smell of bread still faintly present in the air, she felt something she had not felt in long enough that she had stopped naming it. She felt like she was somewhere that needed her to stay. Before she finally stood to go, she went back to the mailboxes one more time. She looked at the 3 new labels, Brennan Barrett Greer, and at the faded 4th label below them, of Calloway. Vera had kept her name here, had maintained this small record of belonging until the end of whatever her end had looked like. And she had arranged things in a particular order, the building to Maggie, the instruction to come before deciding the tenants in their places, all of it assembled with the patience of someone who had 30 years to think about it. Vera had not hoped Maggie would come. Vera had known. The question that rode with Maggie, the 6 blocks to the motel that sat with her through dinner, she barely tasted, and through the early part of a night she could not quite sleep through, was not why Vera had known. The question was simpler and harder than that. It was what exactly Vera had known about her. The phone rang at 6:15 in the morning. Maggie was already awake. She had been awake since 4, lying in the motel room with the ceiling fan turning slowly above her and the question from the night before still working through her mind. She had not resolved it. She had simply lain there with it until the room grew light enough that staying in bed felt like a choice she was making rather than a condition she was in. The number on the screen was one she did not recognize. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was the kind of voice that gets described as smooth, though what that word really means in practice is that all the roughness has been removed from it, deliberately sanded down over years of use until nothing catches, nothing, snags nothing, gives you anything to hold on to. The voice introduced itself as Arthur Whitmore. It said it had wanted to reach out personally. It said it felt important to make that personal connection. It said it would very much appreciate the opportunity to meet at her convenience. Of course, perhaps around 10 o'clock this morning, if that worked for her schedule. Maggie said 10 o'clock was fine. Arthur Whitmore arrived at 9:45. That told her something before he had said another word. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of clothes that announce money not by being flashy, but by being exactly right in every detail, the way expensive things are. Right in ways that are difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss once you have learned to see them. He shook her hand on the sidewalk in front of the Harwick Arms with a smile that had been practiced long enough to become automatic. Behind him, 3 steps back, and to the left was a shorter man, perhaps 15 years younger. Where Arthur Whitmore looked like someone accustomed to standing in front of cameras, this man looked like someone accustomed to standing behind doors. He did not offer his hand. He looked at the building the way a person looks at something they are planning to take apart. Roy Whitmore, the brother Tom had mentioned the previous evening. The third person who had arrived with them stepped forward before Arthur Whitmore could manage the introduction. Patricia Oakes, she said, extending her hand with the practiced ease of someone who had been introducing herself at functions for 30 years. Ward 3 Harwick City Council. She was 58 or so in a navy suit, carrying a leather bag that cost more than Maggie's monthly grocery budget. Her grip was firm, and her smile was warm in the way that well-made traps are comfortable before they close. "I just want to make sure you understand that this project has the council's full support," Oakes said. "Harwick needs this investment. This neighborhood deserves to be part of the city's future." Maggie said nothing to that. She filed it away. "I want to be straightforward with you," Arthur Whitmore said, turning to look at the building's facade. He said this the way people say it when they are about to be something other than straightforward, using the declaration as a kind of inoculation against what follows. "I'm planning something significant for this entire block. Residential mixed use, the kind of development that lifts property values and brings real economic activity back to this part of the city. This building is the center of that plan." He paused in a way that suggested he expected a response. Mr. Shaw mentioned a number, Maggie said. "I'm prepared to go higher than that number," Whitmore said. "Considerably higher. I understand you may have seen some things inside the building that complicated the picture for you. Certain situations." He chose the word situations carefully, which told her that he had thought about which word to use. "I have experience managing relocations in sensitive circumstances, properly with adequate resources with dignity for everyone involved. Relocations in sensitive circumstances." She heard Tom Barrett's voice from the evening before the flatness of it. "Roy doesn't come to help anyone move. The building has structural concerns you may not be fully aware of." Whitmore continued, "Their severity could represent real liability for you as the owner." He said the word liability slowly with a careful emphasis on each syllable, the way someone emphasizes a word when they want it to land in a particular part of the listener's mind. Maggie kept her face still. "I'll need a few more days," she said. Something moved behind Whitmore's expression. Too controlled to be called a reaction, more like a weather change, visible only in the quality of the light. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." He and Roy moved a few steps away, and Patricia Oakes stepped closer to Maggie, lowering her voice in the way people lower their voices when they want to create the impression of candor. "I'm going to be honest with you," Oakes said. Woman to woman, the people living in that building right now are in legally complicated situations. If this goes through a formal process through inspections and code enforcement and court orders, they won't have time to make arrangements. Arthur at least gives them time. She paused. I think you're someone who cares about what happens to them. You're threatening me in a concerned voice, Maggie said. Oakes did not lose her composure. I'm giving you the realistic picture. I did bookkeeping for 30 years, Maggie said. I know the difference between the realistic picture and pressure dressed up as information. Oakes held her gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back. When both cars had driven away, Maggie stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building. Roy Whitmore had spent the entire conversation doing a slow circuit of the exterior, not listening to his brother and Oakes, just walking the perimeter of the building, with his eyes moving over the brickwork and the foundation and the roof line. The way you walk around something you are already planning to work on. She went upstairs and knocked on Douglas Finch's door. He made coffee that was bad in the specific way of someone who does not particularly care about coffee, who makes it because it is a thing that is made in the morning rather than because he has any investment in the result. He handed her a mug and she accepted it because she needed something to hold. He moved a box off the second chair and she sat down. Tell me everything, she said. Douglas spread the key documents across the cleared section of the desk. Maggie read through them the way she had read financial records for 3 decades, tracking patterns, noting when numbers and dates refused to align the way honest paperwork does. She found the chain quickly. 3 documents cross-referenced. These establish it, she said, pointing. Yes, Douglas said, and looked at her differently than he had at the beginning of the conversation. And this one, she pointed to the May 1975 permit application. This is what Helen found. Best I can tell, he said, approved in 7 days. Anyone in that office would have known that was impossible under normal circumstances. He placed the last document on the table between them. The report on Helen's disappearance filed June 1975. Detective R.H. Whitmore, Harwick Police Department. Case closed in 90 days. Voluntary disappearance. No further investigation pursued. How long do we have before he finds another way in, Maggie asked. Douglas was quiet for a moment. He's a patient man when he needs to be, he said, but he's also a man who doesn't like loose ends. She went back to her temporary room in Unit 3A that afternoon. She had been sleeping in Vera's old apartment since the second night. The motel room had started to feel like a waiting room, a place for someone who had not yet decided where they were going, and she had quietly stopped going back to it. The apartment was furnished simply the furniture of someone who had pared down to what she needed and found that sufficient. A chair by the window, a small table, a bookshelf with a careful selection of volumes that Maggie had been reading the spines of over the past 2 days. History mostly, local history, the kind of books that tell you how a place became what it is. She sat in the chair by the window, and for the first time since she had arrived in Harwick, she let herself think clearly about what selling would mean. Not about the money, though. The money would be real and would be useful. Not about the liability, though. That was a real consideration for a woman of 71 on a fixed income. She thought about what selling would look like on a Tuesday morning, 6 months from now, when she was back in Millbrook, back in the apartment, with the reading chair by the west window, back in the routine that had been narrowing around her so slowly she had almost stopped noticing. She thought about Emily Barrett, 12 years old, sitting perfectly still on the worn sofa, while her father asked a question that might determine where her family lived next month. She thought about Sadie, 17, who had said, "I'm not going back where I came from," in the voice of someone who has had to mean that sentence with their whole body. She picked up her phone. She found the number for Leonard Shaw's office and opened the call screen and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked around the room, Vera's room, the room of a woman who had spent 30 years gathering evidence piece by piece, maintaining a mailbox with her name on it, in a building she had decided was worth protecting, and who had left it all to a distant relative. She believed, for reasons Maggie was still working out, would not simply sign the first paper someone put in front of her. She put the phone down. She was still sitting there when she heard it. From above, from the 4th floor, through the ceiling of Unit 3A, the sound of a piano. Not a recording, not the record player, she had come to recognize over the past 2 days. Something live and hesitant, a single note pressed and released, then a short phrase attempted and stopped, then silence. Then the phrase tried again in a slightly different form. Walter Greer was not a pianist. He was a trumpet player. She had seen the photographs in his collection, the recording credits on the back covers of his albums. But the piano upstairs, the one she had almost mistaken for a piece of furniture under its white cloth, had a name. Sally. His wife Miriam had given it that name. She listened to the fragments coming through the ceiling and did not move. Her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Portland, Oregon area code. She answered. The voice was male, younger than she expected, tightly controlled in the way of someone managing strong feeling. Is this Margaret Calloway? My name is Owen Greer. I'm Walter Greer's son. I've been trying to reach him for months, and someone in the building told me there was a woman staying there who might be able to tell me how he is. He stopped. She could hear him steadying himself on the other end of the line. He's playing piano, she said. Silence. The kind that has weight in it. He hasn't touched that piano since my mother died, Owen said. His voice had changed. Something in it that had been braced against a particular answer had released. She said, I know, I could tell. Another silence shorter. Then I'm coming there. I can get a flight tonight. I just need to know if he'll let me in. Maggie looked at the ceiling, where the fragments of sound were still finding their way down through the old building. Come, she said. I can't promise what he'll do, but come. The envelope had not been opened. She knew that much. She went up to the 4th floor an hour later with 2 cups of tea and sat in the second chair and listened to the record that was playing. Walter did not speak. The piano was recovered now under its cloth, but when she glanced toward it, she thought she could see that the cloth had been repositioned, rearranged by hands that had touched it recently. The dust at its base had been disturbed. She said nothing about the piano. After a while, Walter said without preamble or explanation, Miriam used to say that the hardest thing about music was that you couldn't do it alone. Not really. You could play by yourself in a room, but it wasn't the same thing. You were always playing for someone, even when no one was there. He went quiet. Frank, Maggie said, my husband. He used to say I kept things in like a locked filing cabinet. He meant it kindly. She paused. I think he was right. Walter turned his head, slightly not toward her, but in her direction. 9 years is a long time to keep things locked, he said. It is, she agreed. The record reached its end, the room filled with the soft, repeating sound of the needle in the inner groove. Neither of them moved to change it. They sat in the failing afternoon light, 2 people who had each lost the person they had organized their life around, and they sat with that without trying to make it into something it was not. Finally, Maggie stood and lifted the needle. She looked at him. Your son is coming, she said. He'll be here in the morning. Walter said nothing. He looked back out the window, but his hands, which had been loose in his lap for the entire conversation, closed slowly around each other. She took that as the answer it was. That evening, a sheet of paper appeared under the front door of the Harwick Arms. No envelope. Folded once. The letterhead looked official, the kind of official that is constructed to look like the real thing without committing to any specific identifier that could be checked. City of Harwick, Department of Buildings and Safety Compliance. The notice informed the owner of record that the property at 14 Aldrich Street had been flagged for an emergency structural inspection scheduled for the following Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Failure to provide access would result in further enforcement action. Maggie brought the paper to Tom Barrett, who looked at it for 10 seconds. The building is fine, he said. I've been through every system in this place. Boiler load bearing walls foundation. The bones are good. She asked him to look at the letterhead. He did. I've worked construction in this county for 20 years, he said. I know every permit, office, and inspection department in this region. He handed the paper back to her. This office doesn't exist. She called Patricia Oakes's office the next morning. The assistant said Oakes was in a meeting. Maggie left her name and number. 2 hours later, Oakes called back. Her voice had shifted since the sidewalk conversation. Still composed, but something underneath the composure had tightened. Mrs. Calloway, I hope you're thinking carefully about all of this. I am, Maggie said. Specifically, I'm thinking about a Department of Buildings and Safety Compliance that doesn't appear in any city directory I can find, in a scheduled inspection signed by someone named R.W. Whitmore. Silence. Not long, but long enough to confirm that Oakes had not expected this particular level of preparation. There may have been an administrative error, Oakes said carefully. The name on the signature line, Maggie said. Is that Roy Whitmore, Arthur's brother? A pause that was its own answer. I want to be clear about something, Oakes said, and her voice had changed again, tighter. Now the warmth compressed by something more urgent. The people in that building are in a precarious legal position. If this situation escalates into formal code enforcement proceedings, I cannot protect them. The timeline would be very short, very disruptive for everyone. Are you protecting them or are you describing what will happen to them if I don't comply? Maggie said. I'm giving you an accurate account of the situation. You're telling me that if I don't sell, you'll use city machinery to make life impossible for a 17-year-old girl and a family with 4 children, Maggie said. And you're telling me this in a voice that's supposed to sound like concern. The line was quiet. You have until Monday, Oakes said, and her voice was flat now, all the warmth gone. She ended the call. Maggie stood in Vera's kitchen with the phone in her hand and thought about the word Monday. 4 days. 4 days to make a decision that Vera had apparently spent years preparing for, that Douglas Finch and his late wife had been working toward from opposite ends, that Helen Calloway at 23 years old had stumbled into and had not come back from. She called the number Douglas had given her. The woman who answered said Connecticut Ledger, investigation desk. My name is Margaret Calloway, Maggie said. I own a building called the Harwick Arms on Aldrich Street in Harwick. I understand you've been looking at a developer named Arthur Whitmore for approximately 2 years. I have documents of property owner's signature on the chain of custody in full cooperation. I'd like to talk. A pause, not the kind that means thinking, the kind that means recognizing something you have been waiting for. I can be in Harwick by Saturday afternoon, Nora Cassidy said. She came on Saturday. She was 34 with the particular focused quality of someone who had been waiting 2 years for exactly this phone call and was not going to waste it now that it had arrived. She sat at Douglas's clear desk with a legal pad and went through the documents, methodically asking questions that confirmed she understood what she was looking at. At some point, Sadie appeared in the doorway with a basket and set it on the end of the table without speaking. Nora ate 3 of the rolls without breaking her concentration. At the end of 3 hours, Nora put her pen down. This is enough, she said. If your name is on the deed and you're willing to go on the record, this is enough to print. She looked directly at Maggie. I want to make sure you understand what on the record means. Your name will be in the article. Whitmore has lawyers who are very good at making property owners wish they had made different choices. Oakes will work against you through whatever administrative mechanisms she has available. And the people in this building could potentially face accelerated enforcement action if Whitmore decides to make an example. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table at the documents that Dot Finch had started gathering, and Douglas had continued at the stack of papers that represented 3 decades of Vera Calloway's patient, private, largely unwitnessed work. Then she looked at the basket Sadie had left on the table. My name is on the deed, she said. I'm on the record. What else do you need? Nora looked at her steadily. Nothing, she said. That evening, Maggie went back through the documents alone. Douglas had gone to bed. The building had settled into its particular nighttime register of small sounds. She worked through the files by the light of the desk lamp, and near the bottom of one of the accordion folders, between 2 larger documents that had been keeping it flat, she found something that even Douglas had apparently not noticed was there. A laminated card, employee identification, City of Harwick Office of the City Contractor, 1974. The photograph showed a young woman, 22 years old, with her hair pulled back, and a direct, steady gaze that looked straight into the camera without flinching. The name on the card was Helen Calloway. Maggie looked at the photograph for a long time. There was something in the line of the jaw, in the particular way the eyes held the camera, that was familiar in the way family resemblances are familiar. Not a copy, but an echo, the same chord played in a different register. Helen looked like Vera, and Vera had looked like the older Calloway women Maggie remembered from childhood gatherings. And those women looked something like the face Maggie saw in the mirror every morning. She had been 23 years old. She had found a document that showed something wrong was happening, and she had reported it because that was the kind of person she had been, someone who believed that finding something wrong and reporting it was the obvious next step, the step you simply took when you saw what she had seen. She had not come back. Maggie set the card down carefully on the desk. She sat in the quiet of the archive that Douglas and Dot and Vera had built between them, the accumulated weight of what one family had done to this city and what other people had quietly spent their lives trying to make visible. And she thought about Monday morning and Roy Whitmore's eyes moving over the building's exterior and the word liability spoken slowly and deliberately on a sidewalk. Then she thought about Vera's handwriting at the bottom of a formal letter. Before you decide. She turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a moment. She thought she could hear faintly from somewhere above the sound of a single piano note pressed once and then released into the silence of the building. She was not going to call Leonard Shaw. She had known that since the afternoon she had opened the call screen and looked at his number and put the phone back down. But knowing something and arriving fully at it are different things, and she had needed the evening with Helen Calloway's photograph to complete the distance between them. Roy Whitmore would arrive Monday morning with a fake inspection order and two men who got paid to stand in doorways. And she would be on the front step when he did. She climbed the stairs to Vera's apartment and lay down in the dark and thought about what she was going to wear. The gray coat had been in the back of the closet in Vera's apartment since Maggie had hung it there on her second night in Horrock, not thinking much about the choice. She had bought it for Frank's memorial service 9 years ago and had worn it perhaps 4 times since, always for occasions that required something formal and dark and serious. She had not thought of it as a coat she wore for herself. It was a coat for events. She put it on at 7:30 Monday morning and stood in front of the small mirror above the bathroom sink and looked at herself for a moment. The coat fit exactly as it had 9 years ago, which told her something about the kind of life she had been living, a life in which not much had changed, in which the person who had bought this coat and the person who was wearing it now had remained in close enough agreement about everything that the coat still fit precisely. She went downstairs and stood on the front step and waited. Roy Whitmore arrived first. He came on foot from the direction of Main Street with 2 men behind him carrying clipboards that were accessories rather than tools props, chosen to suggest official process. Roy himself wore a canvas jacket and work boots, dressed for a building rather than a meeting. And when he saw Maggie standing on the step in her gray coat, his pace did not change, but something in his face reassessed. Arthur Whitmore's car arrived 2 minutes later. Arthur got out alone this time. No Oakes. That was the first thing Maggie noticed. Patricia Oakes, who had been present at every previous encounter as a signal of institutional endorsement, was not here today. The absence said something she filed away. Miss Calloway. Arthur's voice was smooth as always, though the smile behind it had less room to work in than before. I heard about the inspection notice. I wanted to come personally, make sure everything proceeds smoothly. I'm sure you did, Maggie said. I think we should talk inside. He gestured toward the door. I think not, Maggie said. She had her phone in her hand and she raised it slightly so he could see it without making a performance of the gesture. She had been a bookkeeper. She understood that the most effective communication was often the least theatrical. I've been in contact with a journalist named Nora Cassidy, she said. She's been researching your development history in this city for approximately 2 years. She now has access to documents related to permit irregularities going back to 1971, and she has my full cooperation as the property owner of record. The article publishes Thursday. Arthur Whitmore's expression did not collapse. It was too practiced for that, but something behind it shifted in a way that reminded her of a wall that has taken water damage and has not yet shown it on the surface, but has already changed structurally in ways that will become visible soon. I don't know what you think you have, he said. His voice had dropped. I know exactly what I have, Maggie said, and so will everyone who reads it Thursday morning. Roy Whitmore took a step forward. He was not a large man, but he moved like someone who had used his size as a tool before and expected it to work again. Maggie did not step back. She had decided in Vera's apartment the night before that she was not going to step back, and she found standing here now that the decision held. This building is a liability, Arthur said, and his voice had changed again. The smoothness stripped back to something harder underneath. structurally unsound. There are people living here in violation of city code. If you want to protect them, the best thing you can do is let this move forward. Otherwise, the city will be notified and those people will have nowhere to go. He said the last part slowly. He wanted her to hear what it was, which was a threat wearing the clothing of concern, the same thing Oakes had done on the sidewalk the week before, only plainer, now less dressed up because he had stopped thinking she needed to be managed carefully. That told her something too. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I have been making myself smaller for 9 years. I drove 4 hours to sign a paper and go home. She paused. I'm not going to do that. She held up her phone. Thursday morning. I'd encourage you to speak with your attorney before then. Roy took another step, and the door behind Maggie opened. Tom Barrett stepped out and stood in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Tom was a man who understood that sometimes presence was the entire statement. Sadie came and stood beside him. She was carrying a dish towel, which she had apparently been holding when she heard the voices, and she did not put it down. She just stood there. From the window directly above third floor, a curtain moved. Ann Barrett watching. And from the far end of the entry corridor, Owen Greer walked into view. He had arrived the previous night from Portland, still wearing his travel jacket, when he knocked on Walter's door, and he had been in the building since. He stood at the end of the corridor now, without speaking, a younger man, with his father's stillness, and he looked at Roy Whitmore with the particular steadiness of someone who has already decided what side of a situation they are on. Arthur Whitmore looked at all of it. He looked at Maggie in her gray coat. He looked at Tom in the doorway. He looked at Owen at the end of the corridor. He did the calculation that men like him are always doing, the one about leverage and timing and what the realistic options are, and he arrived at the answer. He turned and walked back to his car. Roy stayed for another 3 seconds, looking at the building one last time with the appraising eyes Maggie had noticed on the very first day. Then he turned and followed his brother. Maggie stood on the step until both cars were out of sight. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was not going to mention that to anyone. Nice coat, Sadie said from behind her. Maggie laughed. It came out before she had decided to let it the real kind unplanned, and it felt strange in the best way. The way things feel when they come from somewhere you had forgotten was still open. She had not laughed like that in longer than she could easily account for. She was still standing there composing herself when she saw the car at the end of the block. Patricia Oakes's car parked and idling. Oakes had not come to the building. She had come to the street, and she was watching from a distance, which told Maggie that she had known this morning might go badly for Whitmore, and had chosen to observe rather than to be seen standing beside him when it did. As Whitmore's car passed Oakes's without slowing, without any acknowledgement between them, the calculation completed itself. Whatever arrangement had existed between those two had just been renegotiated, at least in Oakes's mind. Oakes sat in her car for 2 more minutes. Then she got out and walked toward the building. Mrs. Calloway, she said when she reached the step. Her voice was different from every previous version of itself. Not warm, not performing concern, just businesslike and slightly tired. I need to have a conversation with the city inspector's office about some approvals I participated in over the past 2 years. I have an appointment this afternoon. I thought you should know. Maggie looked at her steadily. This isn't a change of heart, Oakes said, anticipating what Maggie might be thinking. I want to be honest about that, she paused. But sometimes doing the right thing and managing your own interests look the same from the outside. The outcomes are equivalent. I appreciate you telling me, Maggie said. Oakes nodded once and walked back to her car. She drove away in the direction opposite from Whitmore. Tom was still standing in the doorway. He watched Oakes leave. She's protecting herself, he said. Maybe Maggie said, but the outcome is the same either way. She thought about it for another moment. Sometimes that has to be enough. Tom looked at her for a beat. Then he went back inside without saying anything else, which she had learned was his way of agreeing. The article ran on Thursday. Nora Cassidy had been careful and specific and thorough in the way of journalists who know they are going to be scrutinized by lawyers and have prepared accordingly. She laid out the chain of shell companies and the permit irregularities with documentary precision. She wrote about Helen Calloway, 23 years old, who had found the 1975 application and reported it and disappeared, and about the detective assigned to her case, and about what the documents suggested had been done to protect the interests of a family that was still 50 years later attempting to acquire the same land through the same methods. She quoted Maggie directly in 2 sentences that had been approved in advance. She named the building. By Friday morning, the city council had opened a preliminary inquiry. By the following Tuesday, 3 other property owners in Harwick had contacted Nora's paper with accounts of similar experiences with Whitmore's development operation. Similar pressure, similar manufactured violations, similar visits from men who arrived without proper credentials. Arthur Whitmore went quiet. His spokesperson released a statement describing the reporting as misleading and politically motivated. Nobody seemed to find this convincing, including apparently the city council members who had previously been enthusiastic supporters of his development plans and were now in the particular way of politicians who sensed the direction of events considerably harder to reach. Roy Whitmore did not release a statement of any kind. The preliminary inquiry turned into a formal investigation within 3 weeks. Maggie read about it in the Connecticut Ledger online, sitting in Vera's kitchen with her morning coffee, and then she set the phone down and sat for a while looking at the way the morning light came through the window. At this hour, the particular angle of it, the way it fell across the surface of the old table. She had been in Harwick for 5 weeks. She called Leonard Shaw and told him she would not be accepting any offer from Arthur Whitmore. Shaw asked what she planned to do with the property. She said she had some ideas she was still working out. He said he would be available if she needed assistance with documentation. She thanked him and ended the call. The ideas had been taking shape since before the article ran, assembling themselves out of the conversations she had been having and the things she had been observing in the building over the weeks she had been there. She started with the Barretts. She hired a real estate attorney in Hartford, someone who had no history with any of the parties involved, and asked him to draft a proper lease agreement for Unit 3B. Fair market rent adjusted to acknowledge the 3 years of maintenance Tom had performed without being asked the boiler work and the pipe repairs and the weatherproofing that had kept the building habitable through 3 Connecticut winters. When she showed Tom the draft, he read it slowly and carefully, the way he read anything that carried legal weight. And when he finished, he looked up. "You didn't have to account for the maintenance," he said. "I know," Maggie said. He signed it without further comment. Anne came into the room while he was signing and stood beside him and put her hand on his shoulder, and Maggie looked away to give them a moment of privacy. The commercial kitchen license for Sadie was more complicated. It required a physical inspection and some infrastructure upgrades that Maggie had not anticipated. Tom assessed what needed doing and provided the labor himself on his days off at a rate that Maggie later realized was significantly below what he would have charged a stranger. When she pointed this out, he said he had installed commercial kitchen equipment before, and it was not interesting enough to charge full rate for. The license came through on a Wednesday. Sadie stood in the kitchen that afternoon looking at the posted certificate for a long time without speaking. Then she said quietly, more to herself than to Maggie, like it's real now. "It was always real," Maggie said. "I know," Sadie said, "but this makes it real to everyone else." She paused. "Then I've been thinking about what to call it. Officially for the business filing." Maggie waited. "Brennan," Sadie said. "Just that. Simple." She said it with a steadiness that made Maggie think of the girl who had opened a chain door 2 inches and asked 3 verification questions before letting a stranger in. The girl who had kept an address for a shelter in New Haven tucked into a kitchen cabinet. That girl was still there, would always be there, but she was standing now in a licensed kitchen with her name on a posted certificate, and the distance between those 2 moments was not nothing. Maggie hired a structural engineer recommended by Tom to do a proper assessment of the building. The engineer spent 2 days going through the place systematically and produced a report that confirmed what Tom had said from the beginning. The bones were good, the roof needed attention, 2 units needed replumbing. The elevator shaft was not worth restoring, but the stairwells were sound. Nothing that approached the structural crisis Whitmore had described. Nothing that threatened the people who lived here. She contracted the roof work first. Tom supervised the crew, and the job came in under the original estimate. Douglas required a different kind of help. She spent several evenings with him, working through the question of what to do with the archive he had assembled, the documents that Douglas and Dodd had gathered, and that Vera had been adding to for 30 years. A university archive was the answer. They arrived at the history department at the University of Hartford, which had a regional records program and the legal infrastructure to receive and preserve materials of exactly this kind. The donation would give the Yeoman's institutional standing, make them part of the public scholarly record, and render them considerably harder to suppress than they had been when they lived in stacked boxes in a fifth-floor apartment. The paperwork for the donation took 2 weeks to complete. On the day Douglas signed the transfer documents, he brought Dot's photograph from his desk and placed it on the table beside the final stack of papers. And when Maggie came in, he was sitting with his hand resting on the frame, not doing anything, just sitting there. She would have liked this, he said. I know, Maggie said. She sat down across from him and they went through the documents together one last time, the two of them, before they were handed over. It felt like something that needed witnessing. What will you do now? She asked him when it was done. He thought about it genuinely. I think I'll stay here for a while, he said. There's still a lot of local history that hasn't been properly documented. He looked around the apartment, which was still lined with boxes but had a different quality now that the central weight had been lifted from it. And the building needs things. I can be useful. He said it the way someone says something they have just discovered is true. It was Owen who told her about the piano. He had been staying in a rented room 2 blocks away and coming to the building each day, sometimes for a few hours and sometimes until evening. He and Walter had arrived at a careful arrangement, the two of them working out over a series of quiet mornings what they were to each other now, after the silence and the letters and the long distance between Portland and Harwick. Maggie did not ask about the content of those conversations. She recognized them as being between the two of them in a way that required no one else's presence. Owen found her one morning in the lobby and said without preface, he's been playing every day. He didn't want me to tell you, but I thought you should know. Does he know you're telling me? He suspects, Owen said. He hasn't said not to. She went up to the 4th floor that afternoon without tea, without a plan, just knocked and went in. Walter was sitting at the piano, not playing, just sitting at it with his hands resting on his thighs. The white cloth was folded on the floor beside the bench. She could see the keyboard clearly. For the first time since she had arrived, the ivory worn to the texture of old paper at the most frequently played notes. She sat in the window chair. He began to play after a moment. Not a piece of music exactly, not something with a beginning and a composed end, but something that moved through fragments. The way someone moves through a house they have not been in for a long time, opening doors and finding rooms and remembering where things were. He stopped twice, sat with his hands in his lap, and then started again. The second time he stopped, he said without turning. These were Miriam's favorite intervals. The way she described them, I never quite understood what she meant by that. He paused. I think I understand it now. He played a phrase that resolved in a way that felt complete, felt arrived at rather than constructed. When he stopped, the room was quiet in the particular way that music leaves a room, the air still shaped by what had been in it. Not ready, he said. Almost, Maggie said. He turned and looked at her. Almost is more than I had in September. She thought about the piano under its white cloth, the photograph turned face down, the sealed envelope on the shelf. She thought about what Owen had said on the phone that first night. He hasn't touched that piano since my mother died. She thought about how a person builds a silence around themselves so completely that they forget it is a choice they made and begin to experience it as a climate they simply live in. She recognized that. She had been building something similar for 9 years, not as visible, not as total, but recognizable in its architecture. Before she left that afternoon, Walter spoke again without preamble. Vera came to see me, he said, before she passed. He kept his eyes on the keys. She told me she was leaving the building to someone who had lost the thread of things, someone she trusted to find it again. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know who she meant then. I think I do now. Maggie sat with that for a moment, then stood and walked to the door. Emily Barrett knocked on the door of Unit 3A on a Thursday evening in early November. She was 12 years old, and she stood in the doorway holding a piece of paper folded in half, and she held it out to Maggie without explanation. Maggie unfolded it. It was a pencil drawing of the Harwick Arms seen from across the street, the full 6-story face of it, with the arched entrance, in the carved stone lintel, and the brass plate that said 1924. Emily had drawn a window on each floor with light in it, warm light, the kind you draw by pressing harder with a pencil and then smudging the edges gently with a fingertip. Every window lit. Below the drawing, in the careful handwriting of a child who had been taught to write well, a single word: home. Maggie looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked at Emily. "Thank you," she said. Emily nodded and went back downstairs. Maggie heard her feet on the stairs, quick and light, and then the sound of the third-floor door opening and closing, and then nothing. She put the drawing on the table, not in a drawer, not in a folder, on the surface of the table where she would see it. She called Sandra that Sunday. She had been composing the call in pieces for a week, not rehearsing exactly, but letting the elements of it settle into some kind of order. There was a lot to cover. More had happened in 5 weeks in Harwick than had happened in several years in Millbrook, and she was not sure how to account for all of it in a phone call to her daughter in Edinburgh. She called and started talking. She told Sandra about Vera and the letter and the drive and the mailboxes and the jazz from the fourth floor. She told her about Sadie and the kitchen and the $40 a month and I'm not going back where I came from. She told her about the Barretts and the boiler and the Vermont farmhouse and the photograph. She told her about Douglas and Dot and the archive and the 30 years of quiet work. She told her about Helen Calloway's employee card, the photograph of a 23-year-old woman who had looked straight at a camera with the confidence of someone who believed that reporting what you found was simply what you did. She told her about Arthur Whitmore on the sidewalk and what Roy had done with his eyes on the building's facade. She told her about Nora Cassidy and the documents and the decision to go on record and what she had felt in the moment after she made it, the thing that had arrived in her chest, like a door she had not realized was closed opening from the other side. She talked for nearly 40 minutes. She was not sure she had talked to Sandra continuously for that length of time in years. When she finished, there was a pause. "Mom," Sandra said, "are you happy?" Maggie held the phone and thought about the question genuinely. "I'm busy," she said. "Busy in the way I'd forgotten you could be busy, where what you do that day actually matters to something beyond your own routine." "That sounds like yes." "It might be," Maggie said. She was sitting in Vera's kitchen. The radiator knocked from somewhere above, steady and reliable, the sound of a building maintaining its own warmth. From the second floor, barely audible, the timer in Sadie's kitchen, the small mechanical punctuation of a workday that had started at 4 in the morning and would continue until the last of the morning orders was filled and the first of the farmers' market deliveries was packed. From the third floor came Ann Barrett's voice, moving through the morning sounds of 4 children between 4 and 12, getting ready for school, patient and steady, in a way that comes from years of practice. And from the fourth floor, the piano. It was not fragments anymore. It was something that had found its shape, a piece without a name that Walter played each morning, now working through it the way a craftsman works through a difficult piece, tending to the places that did not yet do what he wanted, returning to the beginning and trying again. Owen had described it to Maggie. He said it sounded like something being remembered rather than something being composed. She thought that was exactly right. She ended the call with Sandra and sat for a while in Vera's chair in Vera's kitchen, in the building that Vera had maintained, intended, and protected, and finally handed to someone she had believed would not simply sign the first paper someone put in front of her. She was not sure she had fully found the thread again. She suspected it was not the kind of thing you found all at once, but rather something you picked up incrementally in the places where you made an effort, where you showed up, where you allowed what was happening to matter to you fully instead of at a careful distance. What she knew was that she was here, that the building expected her back each morning, that she would go up to the fourth floor this afternoon and sit in the window chair while Walter worked through his unnamed piece, and that this would feel like the right use of an afternoon. She looked at Emily Barrett's drawing on the table, every window lit. Her suitcase was still in the corner of the bedroom, still open, still being used as a makeshift dresser the way she had been using it since she stopped going back to the motel. She looked at it now and thought that she should probably find a proper chest of drawers. The suitcase was not a permanent solution. The thought arrived without drama, without the weight she might have expected it to carry. A chest of drawers? Something practical. The kind of thing you buy when you have decided where you are going to be. She went downstairs to check whether Sadie needed anything from the hardware store before Earl closed for the morning. The front door of the Harwick Arms, which had required a borrowed can of lubricant and 20 minutes of patient effort to open on the first day, swung easily now. She had adjusted the mechanism herself, a small repair. Nothing technical, just attention applied to something that needed it. She had oiled it and worked the key in and out until the tolerances were right again, until the lock moved the way a lock is supposed to move. She left it unlocked when she went out. She had gotten into the habit of that. The morning air on Aldrich Street was cold now. November cold, the kind that arrives in New England with a seriousness that October only hints at. She stood on the front step for a moment and looked at the street she had looked at for 5 weeks. The same sidewalk and the same brick buildings and the same view down toward Main Street, where she could still see if she looked one of the Whitmore residential signs on a lamppost. Its blue and white colors faded slightly now. Its coming soon looking less certain than it had 6 weeks ago. She would call someone about having it taken down. That was the city's responsibility, but she suspected it would not happen without someone asking. From above, the sound of the piano drifted out through a fourth-floor window that Walter had opened a crack despite the cold. The piece moved through its middle section, the part he had been working on all week, and today it moved through without stopping. She stood on the step and listened to it reach its end. Not finished, but almost. She turned up her collar and went to find the hardware store.